Welcome to This Explainer. As sociologists, we spend a lot of time looking at how societies are built. But today, we're going to examine how they are intentionally broken. Think of us as your guides as we unpack a seriously complex issue: how state-sponsored trauma actually functions, how it hides in plain sight within historical records, and how its devastating effects ripple out across generations. By looking at where law, policy, and human experience intersect, we're going to unravel the social fabric to see exactly how these harmful structures are designed and kept alive over time. Let's get right into it.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the illusion of assimilation. Then, we'll dig into the roots of state violence, explore the concept of multi-generational punishment, look at the modern echoes of these practices, and finally, discuss reclaiming the archive. Section 1. The illusion of assimilation. Let's kick things off by seeing how visual records were historically weaponized, specifically inside the Canadian Indian residential school system, to build a totally false narrative.
Take a really close look at this slide. This is the Garnier football team, photographed around 1953. You see the rigid uniformity, the staged health, the big smiles, right? Well, there's a catch. The photographer here holds absolutely all the power. What they're doing is masking the systemic abuse of forced assimilation with this shiny facade of muscular, happy athletes. It is a highly curated practice designed to tell the public a very specific story. The state desperately needed ongoing public funding and social approval, and this kind of visual propaganda, it was the absolute perfect tool to manufacture consent.
And this brilliantly illustrates the concept of archival silence. As researcher Krista McCracken points out, these state-sponsored images were intentionally crafted to prove to the public that Indigenous children were effectively adapting. But the real danger of archival silence is long-term. If historians look back decades later and only rely on these official state-sponsored archives, they're just going to inadvertently repeat the colonizers' lie. These images acted as indisputable proof of the system's success while actively burying the violence, the corporal punishment, and the cultural erasure happening inside those very same schools.
Section 2. Roots of State Violence. To really understand how a massive system of family removal was justified in the first place, we have to look at its foundational ideology.
How did anyone justify this? Well, it boils down to the eugenics movement. This was a pseudoscientific framework that literally labeled Indigenous populations as savage or inherently inferior. Eugenics wasn't just some fringe, hateful idea. It was weaponized as objective science to create a legal framework for theft and erasure. It gave colonizers the moral and supposedly scientific justification to invade territories and orchestrate the devastating removal of at least 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children. The state essentially used pseudoscience to manufacture consent for violence, building a structural foundation on completely false premises.
Now, I want you to completely contrast that staged, smiling football photograph we just looked at with this stark survivor account documented by researchers LaFrance and Collins. Listen to this reality. Everybody was crying. The lived experience for these children was one of deep trauma, rigid discipline, and the absolute destruction of traditional child-rearing. Kids were punished just for speaking their native languages. Their hair, which is a vital cultural symbol, was forcibly cut off. Imagine the agonizing reality of replacing a mother's deep affection with a warden's cold discipline. These children lived in a constant state of terror, entirely stripped of the nurturing extended family practices of their own communities.
Section 3. Multigenerational punishment. Let's grab some of our core sociological concepts and see how this all builds into an ongoing cycle of trauma that completely outlasts the actual institutions themselves. First, we need to add structural violence to our toolkit. This is the actual legal and institutional enforcement of harm. Think of it as the literal architecture of inequality. It's the federal policies forcing school attendance for Indigenous children, or restrictive immigration laws denying basic protections to laborers. It is violence that doesn't need a weapon because it has a pen and a policy. It's baked right into the system. Running right alongside that is symbolic violence. Now, this isn't necessarily physical violence happening in the moment, it's the looming, invisible threat of it. It's the internalized marginalization that forces people to live constantly on guard. Think about the profound psychological toll that takes. It literally alters how humans behave. It makes people shrink themselves, avoid eye contact, or hide their identities just to get through the day. It's the exhausting, everyday anxiety of knowing society's structure is stacked entirely against you.
So what happens when structural and symbolic violence combine over decades? It creates what sociologists call multigenerational punishment. This is absolutely critical to understand because trauma is literally inherited, socially as well as biologically. This is where legally imposed inequalities spill over and harm individuals who weren't even the initial targets of the law. Just like we saw with residential school survivors, it stripped communities of parenting models, language, and affection across time. When you rob a generation of those critical models, the next generation is born into a deficit. The punishment spills over, and it definitely does not stop in the past.
Section 4, Modern Echoes. Which brings us right to the present day, because these sociological frameworks, they aren't just history. They are the underlying architecture of modern North American social policy. Take modern U.S. immigration policy, for example. Sociologist Laura Enriquez researched 1.5 generation young adults. These are kids who have legal documentation themselves, but their parents are undocumented. Imagine being a teenager with full legal rights, but living in absolute terror every time a police cruiser pulls up behind your mom's car. Because of that constant threat of deportation, that symbolic violence we just talked about, these citizens adopt extreme risk and impression management strategies. They avoid family vacations, they monitor their driving meticulously, and they desperately hide their family status. They are essentially sharing the chronic trauma and economic instability of their parents, experiencing multi-generational punishment in real time.
Another incredibly chilling modern echo is the practice of birth alerts up in Canada. This is a system where hospital staff can flag pregnant women they deem high risk, alerting child welfare authorities. If residential schools were the historical machinery of child removal, birth alerts are its modern iteration. Research shows these alerts disproportionately target marginalized pregnant women, specifically Indigenous and Black mothers, often resulting in sudden child apprehension without any concrete proof of harm or an actual investigation.
Think about the sheer human impact here. Take the story of Kathleen Rogers, an Indigenous woman and 60 Scoop survivor. In 2010, she had her newborn literally taken from her arms by social workers and security guards while she was breastfeeding in the hospital. She had to spend 3 months fighting in court, proving she posed no threat, just to get her own son back. Let that sit for a second. It powerfully and tragically demonstrates that the mechanics of state intervention are still actively ripping families apart today.
Section 5. Reclaiming the Archive. So how on earth do communities begin to dismantle this structural violence and actually heal from such massive, systemic trauma? Well, a crucial step today is systematically dismantling these colonial archives. We have to start by acknowledging the huge power imbalances. Who holds the camera and who writes the captions? Grassroots, Indigenous-led initiatives like the Remember the Children Project are doing vital work here, writing personal truths and actual names back into the historical record. Reclaiming that archival agency is incredibly powerful, but putting real names to the once anonymous faces in those staged photos, you turn a state subject back into a human being. Communities are pulling the narrative out of the hands of state institutions and giving the power unequivocally back to the survivors. Because archives are definitely not neutral. They literally assemble how we think about history, which in turn shapes the social policies of tomorrow. So I'll leave you with this. As you scroll through images, read the news, and consume media today, ask yourself, who is framing the narrative you're looking at, and whose voices are being silenced to build it? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep learning.